They called her a burden from the moment she was born. Not to her face. Society had its rules about such things, but in the whispered conversations between her parents, in the way her mother's friends exchanged knowing glances at church, in the careful distance relatives maintained when she entered a room. Margaret Clare Henderson was the third daughter in a family that had desperately wanted sons. By the time she turned 19, she'd internalized every unspoken criticism, every disappointed sigh, every reminder that she was one more mouth to feed in a household already stretching its resources thin. So when her father announced the arrangement, Margaret didn't protest. How could she? This was what happened to girls like her, girls without dowries, without connections, without the kind of beauty or charm that might have attracted a suitable match through conventional means. The man he'd chosen was a farmer named Thomas Mitchell, 34 years old, who worked a struggling piece of land 40 miles north of their small Pennsylvania town. He'd never married, had no family of note, and wanted a wife willing to work without complaint. On the surface, it looked like exactly what Margaret deserved, a practical solution to a practical problem. But when Thomas arrived at their modest home on the morning of the wedding, he did something no one in Margaret's family had ever done. He looked at her, really looked at her, not with the assessment of a man pricing goods at market, not with the resigned acceptance of someone making the best of a bad arrangement, but with genuine curiosity, as if he was trying to see something beneath the surface that everyone else had missed. Margaret didn't know what to make of it. She'd spent her entire life becoming invisible, perfecting the art of taking up as little space as possible, of being useful without being noticed. But Thomas's gaze unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite name. What happened next would change everything she believed about herself, about marriage, about what it meant to be truly seen by another person. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Henderson household operated on the principle of careful management. Margaret's father, William Henderson, was a bookkeeper at the mill. Respectable work, but not the kind that generated substantial wealth. Her mother, Catherine, came from a family that had once possessed more, though that was rarely mentioned, except in the tense silence that followed the annual tax assessments. Margaret's older sisters, Elizabeth and Anne, had married reasonably well, which meant the family's entire social standing now depended on maintaining appearances, while Margaret remained unpaired and, by extension, a potential liability. Margaret had learned early not to be a burden. While other girls her age engaged in the social activities that might have led to courtship, tea parties, church socials, the occasional dance, Margaret occupied herself with the practical work of the household. She mended clothes with meticulous stitches. She prepared meals that stretched insufficient ingredients into adequate portions. She kept the house spotless, organized the pantry with mathematical precision, and managed her mother's increasingly unpredictable moods with the patience of someone who'd had considerable practice. Margaret, the sitting room needs tending, her mother would call, and Margaret would set aside whatever she was doing. Margaret, I've invited the Carmichaels for supper. Can you manage something presentable? And Margaret would create a meal from whatever remained in their stores, always making sure her sisters had the finest portions, always eating last, always less. She was competent, reliable, invisible. These were not compliments. They were the baseline expectations for a daughter whose primary value lay in her utility. Her mother had never precisely articulated this, but Margaret understood it the way one understands the fundamental laws of physics. It was simply how things worked. At 19, Margaret had begun to accept that this might be permanent, that she would spend her life as an extension of her mother's household, a permanent fixture in the background, managing other people's lives, while her own remained untouched and largely unnoticed. Then her father announced the arrangement with Thomas Mitchell. The news arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in early spring, Her father came home from the mill with a particular expression on his face. Not happy exactly, but relieved. The way a man looks when he's finally solved a problem that's been troubling him for months. "I found a situation," he said that evening over supper. "For Margaret." Elizabeth and Anne exchanged glances. The mother set down her fork with deliberate care. "A situation?" Catherine asked, her voice carefully neutral. "A man, farmer, good solid stock. Owns land outright, no debt. He came through the mill yesterday, asked about hiring help, and we got to talking. He mentioned he was looking for a wife. Someone practical, someone who wouldn't expect much." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, though she couldn't identify the sensation precisely. Fear, perhaps, or relief. "Possibly both. Did you discuss terms?" Her father continued, as if discussing the purchase of livestock. "He's willing to take her without a formal dowry, given the current situation. He seems a reasonable sort. Quiet. Says he works hard and expects the same from his wife." Her mother's response was immediate. "When?" "June. He wanted to give us time to prepare, and just like that, Margaret's future was decided. No consultation, no consideration of her thoughts or feelings on the matter. This was entirely appropriate. Girls her age didn't have thoughts or feelings that mattered in such circumstances. They had duties, obligations. They had the fundamental responsibility of being useful to their families and eventually to their husbands. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret's mother produced a plain white dress from somewhere, undoubtedly sewn by Margaret herself, though she couldn't quite remember doing it. They made the journey to Thomas's property on a grey morning, travelling in her father's borrowed wagon. The landscape grew increasingly rural as they moved north, the cultivated suburbs giving way to farmland and then to stretches of forest that felt almost wild. Thomas's farm appeared suddenly. A modest two-story house with peeling paint. A barn in better condition than the house, fields that stretched toward a distant tree line. It wasn't the poorest property Margaret had ever seen, but it was far from prosperous. The house looked the way many things in Margaret's life looked, functional but tired, maintained but not loved. The physical embodiment of doing just enough to get by. Thomas was waiting on the porch when they arrived. He was taller than Margaret had expected, with the kind of weathered appearance that came from years of outdoor labor. His hair was dark, streaked with silver at the temples. His hands, when he shook her father's hand in greeting, were scarred and calloused. He looked like the kind of man who didn't engage in unnecessary conversation. "Miss Henderson," he said, nodding to her. Margaret nodded back, uncertain of the protocol. Should she smile, speak? She settled on simply standing very still and trying to be as inoffensive as possible. The ceremony itself took place at the county courthouse, performed by a clerk who seemed to view the whole affair as a minor administrative task. Margaret's parents stood as witnesses. Thomas wore a shirt that was clearly his best, though it was faded and imperfectly mended. Margaret noticed he'd made an effort to be presentable, which suggested a level of consideration she hadn't anticipated. "Do you take this man?" the clerk asked Margaret. She did. She said so, in a voice barely above a whisper. It was done in less than 10 minutes. They returned to the farm as the sun began its descent toward the western hills. Margaret's parents stayed for perhaps an hour, her mother offering a series of brief, practical instructions about managing the household. Thomas stood apart during this conversation, giving Margaret and her family what privacy was possible in such circumstances. When her parents finally departed, Margaret stood in the center of Thomas's kitchen, still wearing her white wedding dress, and tried to determine what was supposed to happen next. She'd been raised in a household with sisters who'd married before her, but those conversations had been vague and mediated through innuendo and significant silences. She knew, in broad terms, what a wife's duties entailed. The thought made her stomach clench with anxiety. Thomas appeared in the doorway, still in his wedding shirt. "You'll want to change," he said. "There are clothes in the room upstairs. They belong to my sister. They won't fit perfectly, but they'll do for now. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you what you need." Margaret climbed the narrow stairs, relieved to escape his presence, and found a small room with a narrow bed and a basic wardrobe. The clothes were simple: work dresses, practical undergarments, a shawl. She changed quickly, hanging her wedding dress carefully on a hook, as if its pristine state might protect her somehow. When she came back downstairs, Thomas was in the kitchen preparing what looked like supper. Simple food: bread, cheese, a vegetable soup that smelled of herbs and stock. "Sit," he said, indicating the table. Margaret sat. They ate in silence. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence exactly, but Margaret couldn't quite relax into it. She found herself calculating how many dishes needed washing, whether the kitchen was clean enough, whether she was eating too slowly or too quickly. When they finished, Thomas stood and began clearing the plates. "You can rest now," he said. "Tomorrow we start early. I'll show you how things work around here." Relief flooded through her so completely that she felt momentarily lightheaded. "I'll sleep in the barn," Thomas added, as if anticipating her anxiety. "There's no reason to rush into that. You've traveled, you're tired, we have time." Margaret stared at him, trying to process his words. Her husband, her actual husband, was going to sleep in the barn, on their wedding night, for no reason except that she was tired. "Why would you do that?" The question came out before she could stop it. Thomas turned from the sink and looked at her with those same curious eyes he'd used at their first meeting. "Because you look terrified," he said simply, "and because I didn't marry you to be miserable. I married you to have a partner. That doesn't require rushing into anything you're not ready for." He left before Margaret could formulate a response. She stood alone in his kitchen, in her borrowed dress, in a house that was now her home, and felt something entirely unfamiliar settle in her chest. It took her several minutes to recognize the feeling. It was hope. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret woke before dawn on her first full day as Thomas's wife, a habit so ingrained it required no conscious effort. The room was dark, the air carrying the chill of early morning. She lay still for several minutes, listening to the sounds of the farm awakening around her, the low call of roosters, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the wind moving through the old house. Her body ached in unfamiliar ways, not from the abuse she'd half expected the night before, that hadn't come, but from the tension of holding herself so rigidly, so carefully, for hours. Every muscle had been clenched in anticipation of something that never arrived. She rose quietly and dressed in one of the borrowed work dresses, then made her way downstairs. The kitchen was cold and empty. She found kindling and firewood stacked beside the stove and set about building a fire, moving through the motions, with the methodical precision that had defined every task of her life. By the time the sun broke the horizon, there was coffee brewing and bread warming on the stove. Thomas appeared at the kitchen door as the dawn light filled the room. He was already dressed for work, his movements suggesting he'd been awake for some time. "You didn't need to do that," he said, though he didn't sound angry. "Not this morning." "I woke early," Margaret replied, keeping her voice low and steady. "It seemed useful." Thomas poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table. For a moment, he simply drank, studying her in a way that made Margaret want to disappear into the floorboards. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. Margaret blinked. Margaret Clare. You were there when the clerk—" "I know what they called you," Thomas interrupted. "I'm asking what you call yourself, when you're alone, when no one's watching. What name belongs to the person you actually are, not the person you're expected to be?" The question was so unexpected that Margaret struggled to formulate an answer. No one had ever asked her such a thing. Names were assigned. They were spoken by authority figures. They were the labels attached to utility, not expressions of identity. "I don't know," she said finally, and the honesty of it surprised them both. Thomas nodded slowly, as if this answer made perfect sense to him. "Well then, we'll work on that. For now, the chores. I'll show you how things are done around here, and you can tell me what you're capable of and what you need help learning." For the next several hours, Thomas walked Margaret through the operations of the farm. He showed her where he kept the feed for the animals, how much each needed, how to check for signs of illness or injury. He demonstrated the best way to collect eggs without startling the chickens. He introduced her to the dairy cow, a calm beast named Clover, and explained the routine for milking. Margaret absorbed everything with the focused intensity that had made her invaluable in her father's household. But Thomas did something her father had never done. He asked questions. "Does that make sense? Do you have a better way to do that? What do you think would work better here? How would you organize this space if it were yours?" Margaret didn't know how to answer questions like these. When had anyone ever asked what she thought about anything? Her opinions had never been solicited. She'd learned to keep them internal, to offer only what was explicitly requested. "I'm not sure," she admitted finally. "I could try different approaches and see what works best." "Then that's what you'll do," Thomas said. "You'll have the authority to make decisions about how things are managed, at least within the household and the immediate farm operations. If you need something, you tell me, and we figure it out together. This isn't a place where you have to guess what's wanted. You can say what you think, and I'll take it seriously." By midday, Margaret's feet were sore and her back ached, but she'd also discovered something unexpected, a sense of ownership. This work wasn't just her responsibility, it was hers to shape and improve. When she realized that the supply shed was disorganized, she asked Thomas if she could spend the afternoon reorganizing it. He not only agreed, but brought her supplies to help with the task. Over the following weeks, a rhythm emerged that looked nothing like Margaret's life in her parents' household. Thomas rose before dawn and worked in the fields. Margaret managed the house, the animals, the kitchen. But they met for meals together, and they talked. It started with practical matters. Margaret would describe something she'd accomplished: reorganizing the pantry, repairing a broken shelf, discovering a more efficient way to prepare certain foods, and Thomas would listen with genuine interest. He'd ask follow-up questions. He'd offer his own observations. Sometimes he'd implement her suggestions. Sometimes he'd explain why an alternative approach might work better. Gradually, the conversations expanded beyond the practical. Thomas would mention something he'd observed in the community, a family struggling with their harvest, a dispute between neighbors, and ask Margaret's opinion. "What do you think would help the Richardson family?" he might ask. "You seem to understand how people work in a way most folks don't." Margaret, who had never been asked for her insight into human nature, began to articulate observations she'd been making her entire life. How exhaustion made people bitter. How shame made them defensive. How small acts of recognition could shift someone's entire emotional state. "You notice things," Thomas said one evening as they sat on the porch after supper. "Things most people miss because they're too busy talking." "I was taught to be invisible," Margaret said. It was the first time she'd articulated this directly. "It was safer that way. In your father's house, maybe," Thomas replied. "But you're not there anymore. You don't have to be invisible here." One afternoon, as Margaret was sorting through the storage room, she found a collection of books stacked in a wooden crate. Novels mostly, and some volumes of poetry. Their pages were worn, their spines cracked from reading. She brought them to Thomas, curious. "These were my mother's," he said, his expression growing distant in a way she'd never seen before. "She loved reading. Wanted to be a teacher, but my father needed her on the farm. She taught me to read when I was very small, before we understood that his way wasn't interested in having an educated son." "Were they happy?" Margaret asked. "Your parents?" "Not particularly," Thomas said. "They were practical, like our arrangement was supposed to be, but they never actually talked to each other. Never asked what the other person wanted. They just coexisted until my father died, and then my mother slowly faded away. He looked at Margaret directly. I'm determined that won't be us. But I'm not educated, Margaret said quickly. I can't discuss literature or philosophy. You can learn, Thomas replied. We both can. That's the point. That's what partnership means. Two people actually developing together, not just managing each other. He pulled a book from the crate, a worn copy of poetry by Emily Dickinson. Here, read this. Tell me what you think. We'll discuss it. That's how education works. Not someone telling you what to think, but engaging with ideas and forming your own opinions. Margaret took the book hesitantly. The act of reading felt slightly transgressive, as if she were stealing something that didn't belong to her. But she opened to a random page and began. That night, unable to sleep, she read by candlelight in her room. The next night, the night after, she began to experience literature not as something meant for other people, cultured people, educated people, people who deserved such things, but as something she could engage with directly, form responses to, keep with her. 3 weeks into their marriage, Margaret found herself sitting at the kitchen table on a rainy afternoon, discussing poetry with her husband, offering her own interpretations of Dickinson's words, actually debating whether she agreed with Thomas's assessment of a particular poem. She'd never debated anything with anyone before. More significantly, she'd never considered that her perspective might be valid enough to merit debate. I think the speaker is describing the paralysis of grief, she said, pointing to a particular stanza. Not the acute pain of loss, but that moment where everything becomes static, where nothing makes sense because the framework that made sense before is gone. The bird isn't hope. The bird is the moment when you realize you might recover, and that terrifies you more than the grief. Thomas listened carefully. That's an interesting interpretation. I was thinking of it as more redemptive. The bird as a genuine sign of hope. But your reading makes more sense with the overall tone. How did you see that? Because, Margaret said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke, she's someone who understands what it means to be trapped, isolated. So when she describes hope as this fragile thing that might fly away, it makes sense that she's also afraid of it. The conversation ended there, but something had shifted between them. Margaret had offered an interpretation rooted in her own experience, and Thomas had treated it as valuable. Not because it was correct, but because it was hers. That evening, as they prepared supper together, Thomas chopping vegetables while Margaret managed the bread, he asked her directly, Margaret, do you want to continue living this way? Here, on the farm, with me? It was a question no one had ever asked her. Not her parents, not her sisters, not society. The assumption had always been that a woman accepted her circumstances and made the best of them. Choice was a luxury afforded to men. Margaret stopped what she was doing and actually considered the question. Yes, she said finally. Though I think I'd like to be called something else. Something I choose. What would you like to be called? Margaret thought about the girl she'd been. Small, silent, invisible. She thought about the woman she was becoming. Someone with opinions. Someone capable of shaping her own environment. Someone whose perspective mattered. Mary, she said. Not Margaret. Mary, it's simpler. It's mine. Then Mary it is, Thomas said. From now on, that's who you are. Not Margaret Henderson. Not Mrs. Thomas Mitchell. Just Mary. The person you're actually becoming. It was the first time in her life that Margaret had actively named herself. The first time she claimed something as truly her own. She couldn't have known, in that moment, that this act of self-naming was only the beginning. That the woman she was becoming would challenge not just Thomas's expectations, but the entire community's understanding of who she was capable of being. 2 months into her marriage, Mary made her first trip into the nearest town, Riverside, a modest settlement of perhaps 2,000 souls situated along the river from which it derived its name. Thomas had needed supplies from the hardware store, and Mary had asked if she might accompany him. He'd agreed immediately, which somehow made her both eager and apprehensive. She'd worn one of her own dresses, which her mother had finally sent along with supplies, modest, practical, appropriate. nothing that would draw attention or comment. And yet, as she walked beside Thomas down the main street, she felt profoundly visible in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. At the general store, the proprietor's wife, a woman named Eleanor Hutchins, looked up from her accounting as they entered. Her eyes swept over Mary with an assessment so thorough and pointed that Mary felt as if she were being dissected. "Thomas," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the particular brightness that marked forced cordiality. "And this must be the new wife." "This is Mary," Thomas replied, his tone neutral but firm. "Mary, this is Eleanor Hutchins. Her husband owns this store." "Lovely," Eleanor said, though her smile didn't extend to her eyes. "We were all so curious about the arrangement. Thomas has been alone for so long, and then suddenly, well, these things do happen when one is desperate, I suppose." The implication was clear. Thomas was a desperate man who'd had to resort to whatever he could find. Mary herself was whatever he could find. "Mary has proven invaluable on the farm," Thomas said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "She's reorganized nearly every system, improved efficiency substantially, and handles the animals with remarkable skill." Eleanor's smile became more fixed. "How industrious. Tell me, dear, where do you come from?" "We haven't heard much about your family." "Pennsylvania," Mary replied quietly. "My father is a bookkeeper at the mill." "A bookkeeper? I see." Eleanor exchanged a glance with another customer. Margaret immediately recognized it as the female equivalent of a nod, a form of silent communication between women who understood certain hierarchies. "And your mother? Is she of good family?" There was no correct answer to this question. To claim her mother was of good family would be presumptuous and easily disproven. To admit that her mother came from reduced circumstances would be to confirm whatever assumptions Eleanor was already forming. "She is my mother," Mary said finally. "And I am here now." Thomas placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture of support that somehow made things worse. Eleanor's eyes tracked the movement, and Mary saw something flash across her face. Not just judgment, but something closer to disappointment, as if she'd expected Thomas to handle the situation differently. Over the following weeks, word spread through Riverside. Thomas Mitchell had married a poor girl from Pennsylvania with no connections and no prospects. The union was widely interpreted as either a tremendous act of charity on his part or evidence of questionable desperation. What wasn't discussed, at least not to Mary's face, was any possibility that he might have actually chosen her deliberately, that there might be substance to their partnership beyond the practical. The women of Riverside were not unkind, precisely, but they maintained a careful distance that felt colder than outright hostility. At the market, they acknowledged her politely, but didn't include her in their conversations. At the church social events Thomas occasionally insisted they attend, they treated her with the cordial indifference one might show a distant acquaintance, of no particular importance. What Mary began to notice, however, was the pattern of their questions when they did engage with her. They wanted to know about Thomas, how much land he owned, what his prospects were, whether he'd mentioned expanding the farm. They wanted to understand her role in facilitating his success, as if she were a tool he'd acquired rather than a partner he'd chosen. One afternoon, as Mary was collecting vegetables from a roadside stand, a woman named Catherine Pearson, wife of the local banker, approached her. "Your husband is quite lucky," Catherine said, selecting tomatoes with deliberate care. "So many farmers lack the organizational capabilities to truly prosper. It's good he found someone willing to do the hard work." "Thomas works very hard," Mary said carefully. "He's the one building the farm." "Of course," Catherine agreed, her tone suggesting she disagreed entirely. "But a man needs a wife who can support his ambitions. I assume that's what you're attempting to do." There was a challenge embedded in the statement, though not an overt one. Catherine was essentially asking whether Mary understood her place in the hierarchy of their marriage, whether she grasped that her role was to support Thomas's goals, not to have her own. That evening, Mary mentioned the conversation to Thomas as they prepared supper. She expected him to dismiss Catherine's implications, to reassure her as he had in the past. Instead, he went quiet. "What does it matter what they think?" he asked finally. "It doesn't," Mary said. "I'm just noticing patterns, the way they talk to me, the assumptions they make about why I'm here." "And how does it make you feel?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious in a way that suggested he wanted an honest answer, not reassurance. Mary considered this carefully. "Diminished," she admitted, "as though everything I do here is only valuable insofar as it serves your ambitions. As though I'm only interesting as an extension of your life, not as a person with my own value." Thomas set down the knife he'd been using to chop vegetables. "That's not how I see you. You know that." "I do know that," Mary said. "But they don't. And I'm beginning to understand that what I believe about myself might not be enough if no one else sees it." This realization, though difficult, prompted something practical in Thomas. The following week, he approached Mary with a proposal. There was a small schoolhouse about 5 miles from their farm where the local children received their education. The schoolteacher, Miss Rebecca Hartford, had mentioned to Thomas at the market that she was overwhelmed with a particularly large class and was considering whether to turn away new students. "What if you helped?" Thomas suggested. "Not as a paid position, at least not formally, but voluntarily for a few hours a week. You could work with the younger children on reading and arithmetic. Build a relationship with the community that way." Mary's first instinct was to decline. Wasn't volunteering simply another form of invisibility, another way of being useful without being valued? But Thomas continued. "You're the most intelligent person I know," he said. "You read constantly. You've taught yourself more in the past 2 months than most people learn in years. Those children need someone like that, and the community needs to see that you're more than just my wife." So Mary began visiting the schoolhouse on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Miss Hartford was a woman in her early 30s, educated at a teacher's college, and refreshingly direct in her manner. Within minutes of meeting Mary properly, she recognized something in her, an intellectual capacity that had been constrained but not broken. "Where did you study?" Miss Hartford asked, observing how carefully Mary worked through a mathematics problem with one of the older students. "I didn't," Mary replied. "My sisters attended school briefly, but I stayed home to help manage the household." Rebecca's eyebrows rose slightly. "And yet you clearly have a mind for teaching. Have you considered what you might have accomplished with formal education?" No one had ever asked Mary what she might have accomplished with anything. The question was so disorienting that she couldn't immediately formulate an answer. Working at the schoolhouse did, slowly, shift how some in Riverside perceived her. Miss Hartford was well respected, and her evident regard for Mary's capabilities seemed to carry weight with certain families. Mary was no longer quite so invisible, though she now found herself visible in a different way. Some women began to regard her with a subtle resentment, as if she were attempting to rise above her station. But there were others, mothers of children in the school, families struggling on farms adjacent to Thomas's, who began to see Mary differently. When the blacksmith's daughter fell ill with fever, Mary was the one who sat with the girl's mother and suggested practical steps for managing the delirium. When a neighbor's child wouldn't eat after a trauma, it was Mary who understood the pattern and helped the mother work through what might help. She wasn't doing anything miraculous. She was simply paying attention, noticing details that others overlooked, drawing on her lifetime of observing people and their needs. But in a community where women were typically confined to specific roles, this kind of discernment appeared almost extraordinary. 3 months into her visits to the schoolhouse, Thomas came home with a peculiar expression on his face. "The Reverend came to speak with me today," he said, as they sat on the porch after supper. Mary's stomach tightened. The Reverend was not a man who made social calls to farmers without cause. What did he want? "Apparently, there's been some discussion at the church about whether you might teach a regular class. Mathematics, reading, basic composition. They'd want to pay you a small salary, nothing substantial but legitimate compensation. Mary stared at him. The church. But they barely acknowledge my presence. They acknowledge your capabilities now, Thomas said. Miss Hartford has made it quite clear what you can do. And apparently the Reverend's wife would like her children to receive instruction from you specifically. Because I'm respectable now? Mary asked, her tone bitter. Because I've proven I'm not entirely useless? Because you're genuinely talented at teaching, Thomas corrected. Because you've shown the community something they didn't expect. And yes, partly because respectable women endorsing you makes others willing to believe you might actually be worth something. Mary felt a complicated surge of emotions. Gratitude that her work was being recognized, but also anger that recognition had been conditional all along. That she'd had to prove herself valuable through work rather than simply being acknowledged as inherently worthy. I'll do it, she said finally, but not because I'm trying to fit into their idea of what I should be. I'll do it because teaching actually matters to me. Because those children deserve better than thinking they're limited to whatever their parents can teach them. That, Thomas said, reaching over to take her hand, is exactly why you should do it. The following Sunday, after the service, the Reverend's wife formally extended the teaching offer, and Mary Mitchell, the invisible third daughter who'd been married off to a poor farmer, became an educator. Not because she'd been rescued by a good man, though Thomas's faith in her had certainly mattered, but because she'd decided that her own capabilities were worth developing, and because she'd found someone willing to believe that being valuable didn't require performing usefulness for others' benefit. The community hadn't entirely transformed their perception of her, but they'd begun to see possibility where they'd previously seen only circumstance. 6 months into her work at the schoolhouse, Mary found herself facing a situation that would fundamentally test both her marriage and her understanding of who she was becoming. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with a conversation between Thomas and the Reverend. After Sunday service, the Reverend wanted Mary to help with a community initiative, a fund to support families whose crops had failed due to an unusually harsh spring frost. The church would collect donations, and Mary was being asked to assess which families needed assistance most urgently and how the funds should be distributed. It was, on the surface, a generous role, recognition of her judgment and capability, but it came with complications no one had explicitly mentioned. The first hint of trouble came from Eleanor Hutchins, who appeared at the schoolhouse on a Tuesday afternoon with her youngest child. After the lesson, she lingered. "I hear you're involved in this charity assessment," Eleanor said, her tone conversational but her eyes sharp. "That must be quite the responsibility for someone so recently arrived in our community." "The Reverend asked me to help," Mary replied carefully. "Of course he did," Eleanor said. "Though I do wonder if he considered the implications. It must be difficult, deciding which of your neighbors truly deserve help and which might simply be less industrious. Such judgments can make enemies if one isn't careful." Mary understood the warning embedded in Eleanor's words. By deciding who received help, she would inevitably be deciding who didn't, and those decisions would create resentment. When she mentioned this to Thomas that evening, he surprised her by suggesting she might decline the role. "I don't think you should do it," he said directly. "Not because you're incapable, you'd be excellent at it, but because it will put you in a position where people will blame you personally for their hardships. And I'm not sure you're ready for that kind of conflict." "Why does that matter?" Mary asked, though she felt the question was somewhat unfair. She knew why it mattered. She'd spent her entire life avoiding conflict. "Because people can be cruel when they feel wronged," Thomas said. "And because I worry that taking on this role might expose you to that in ways you haven't experienced before." "I was ignored and dismissed my entire childhood," Mary replied, her voice sharper than she intended. "I was sent to marry a stranger with no say in the matter. I think I can handle some discomfort from community members." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Then what did you mean? Mary pressed. That sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones you trust, Thomas said slowly. People you've known for years, who suddenly turn against you. It's different than dismissal or cruelty from strangers. It penetrates differently. Despite his concerns, Mary accepted the role. She told herself it was because the work mattered. Families genuinely needed help. But part of her, she recognized later, was proving something. Proving that she could handle responsibility. Proving that Thomas's initial protective instinct was unnecessary. Proving that she was stronger than he apparently believed. She threw herself into the assessment work with characteristic thoroughness. She visited families, listened to their circumstances, examined their resources. She made detailed notes and careful calculations. And she made decisions about who would receive funds and who would receive advice about other solutions instead. For the first month, the distributions went smoothly. Families who received funds were grateful. The community seemed satisfied with her judgments. Mary felt the validation deeply. Her discernment was being valued. Her decisions were making a tangible difference. Then came the Westons. The Weston family, husband, wife, 3 children, lived on a small plot of land 2 miles from Thomas and Mary's farm. Robert Weston was a difficult man, known for drinking heavily and for occasional violent outbursts. His wife Sarah bore the consequences silently, as wives were expected to do. Their farm had indeed been badly affected by the frost, but their struggles were as much about Robert's poor decisions and poor character as they were about weather. When Mary assessed their situation, she determined that they had enough resources to survive if managed carefully, and that additional charitable funds would likely be wasted. She recommended they receive limited assistance, enough for seed for a small garden, not enough to sustain their regular operations. Robert Weston, it turned out, had expected to receive substantial funds. He'd been banking on it, already making plans for what he would do with the money. When he learned of Mary's recommendation, he became furious. The rumors started at the tavern. Robert, apparently, had taken to telling anyone who would listen that Mary Mitchell was using her newfound position to punish families she deemed morally inferior, that she was playing God with charitable funds, that she deliberately recommended against helping him because she considered his family unworthy. More damningly, he'd begun to insinuate that Mary's recommendations for other families were based on personal favoritism, that she helped people she liked and withheld help from. Though she didn't, none of this was particularly sophisticated in its dishonesty, but it was effective. Mary began to notice the shift almost immediately. Women who'd been friendly became distant. Parents who'd been eager for their children to receive her instruction suddenly expressed concerns about her methods. The Reverend's wife, who'd championed the teaching position, began asking pointed questions about the assessment decisions. Thomas noticed the change before Mary fully acknowledged it. He came home one afternoon to find her reorganizing the kitchen pantry with slightly more force than was necessary. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing," Mary said, aware even as she spoke that the lie was transparent. "Mary," she stopped, hands braced against a shelf. "The Western assessment. Apparently I've made an enemy. Robert's been telling people I'm biased and vindictive. Is he creating a genuine problem, or are you interpreting normal disappointment as judgment?" Thomas asked, a question so clearly intended to help her think critically that it somehow made her angrier. "Both, maybe," Mary snapped. "What does it matter? The point is that I'm being questioned. My judgment is being questioned, and it's spreading." "Then we address it," Thomas said simply. "We explain your reasoning. We show your work. We make it clear that the assessment was thorough and fair." "That won't change how people feel about it," Mary said. "No," Thomas agreed, "but it might change how people think about it." "There's a difference." Over the following week, Mary compiled detailed documentation of her assessment process. She explained her methodology clearly, documented the circumstances of each family, showed the calculations for how much help was sufficient versus excessive. It was thorough and rational and completely ineffective against emotion. The real crisis came at a church social, when Mary overheard Eleanor Hutchins speaking to a group of women in the parlor. "It's the power," Eleanor was saying. "That's what happens when you give someone like that too much authority too quickly. She's barely been part of this community for 6 months, and suddenly she's making decisions about everyone else's welfare. Of course, people are questioning her judgment." Mary, standing in the doorway, felt something crystallize in her chest. She walked directly into the room. "I followed a clear methodology," Mary said, her voice steady and quiet. "Every decision was documented and justified. If you have specific concerns about specific assessments, I'm happy to explain my reasoning." The women fell silent. Eleanor recovered first, her smile becoming sharp and bright. "My dear," she said, "we're just having a conversation. No need to be defensive." "I'm not being defensive," Mary replied. "I'm being clear. I made decisions based on available information and careful analysis. If that disappoints you, that's unfortunate. But it doesn't mean my judgment was unsound." That evening, Thomas found her on the porch, staring out at the fields that were just beginning to green after the frost damage. "I made this worse," Mary said without preamble. "By defending myself so directly, I made it worse." "Did you?" "Yes. Now I'm not just someone who made hard decisions. I'm someone who's defensive about being questioned. Someone who doesn't accept that community decisions require community consensus." Thomas sat beside her. "What would you have done differently?" "Not taken the role in the first place," Mary said bitterly. "Not exposed myself to this." "Or?" Mary turned to look at him. "Or what? Or what's the third option besides accepting the role uncritically or not taking it at all?" Thomas asked. "What if you take it, but you also accept that you'll make decisions people disagree with, and you don't have to be perfect about managing their disappointment?" "People will be angry." "Some of them will," Thomas agreed. "That's not your responsibility to fix. Your responsibility is to make decisions you believe are right based on the best information available. After that, people get to feel however they feel." "That seems lonely," Mary said quietly. "It is," Thomas replied. "But it's the price of actual agency. When you're invisible, nobody expects anything from you, so there's no disappointment. But now that you're visible, now that you're making real decisions that affect real people, some of those people are going to be unhappy. That's not a failure on your part. That's just how the world actually works." Over the following months, the situation didn't resolve so much as it gradually became part of the community's normal functioning. Some families remained grateful for assistance and defensive of Mary's judgment. Others remained convinced she'd treated them unfairly. The Reverend, at least, stood firmly behind her assessment process, which gave her institutional support even when personal relationships remained strained. What Mary learned through this experience was that visibility had a cost. That being seen and valued meant also being blamed and resented. That she could make thoughtful, carefully reasoned decisions and still disappoint people. That not everyone would understand her motivations. And that was ultimately acceptable. Thomas, meanwhile, had revealed something she hadn't fully grasped before, that he saw her not as someone to protect from conflict, but as someone capable of managing it. The distinction was subtle but profound. His initial caution about the role hadn't been doubt in her abilities. It had been recognition that capability didn't exempt you from pain. By the time autumn arrived, Mary understood that her marriage wasn't a rescue story. It was a partnership between two people learning together what it meant to live authentically in a world that preferred convenient fictions. And that foundation, that actual seeing and being seen, would prove far more important than she could yet realize. Winter arrived that year with unusual severity. The first snow came in November, heavy and unexpected. And by December, the landscape had transformed into something almost unrecognizable. White fields stretching toward a slate-gray sky. Trees bent under the weight of accumulated ice. Thomas spent long hours managing the animals, ensuring they had adequate shelter and feed. Mary worked the household, managing the fire, preparing meals that would sustain them through the cold months ahead. By mid-January, the community's stores were running lower than anticipated. The harsh weather had delayed shipments from the larger towns. The church began organizing relief efforts again, but this time the process was different. After the Western situation, the Reverend had restructured the system, distributing assessment responsibilities among multiple people rather than concentrating it in Mary's hands. But Mary still observed, still thought carefully about who was struggling most, still noticed things others overlooked. In early February, she visited the schoolhouse on a particularly cold afternoon. The heating system in the building was inadequate, and she'd brought extra blankets for the youngest children. As she worked with students on their letters, she noticed something about Samuel Crawford, a quiet boy of about 7 who lived with his elderly grandmother. His fingernails were dark, not from dirt, but from what appeared to be frostbite. His hands trembled constantly when he tried to hold a pencil. His breathing had a particular quality that made her pause mid-lesson to really observe him. When Miss Hartford broke for lunch, Mary asked about the boy. Samuel's situation is difficult, Rebecca admitted. His grandmother is failing. She can barely care for him, let alone provide adequate heat in winter. They have shelter and some resources, so they didn't qualify for the emergency relief, but she trailed off, clearly troubled. But they're still in crisis, Mary finished. That evening, Mary discussed the situation with Thomas. His response surprised her. "You need to talk to the Reverend," he said, "but carefully. Not as the person who's already been accused of favoring certain families, but as someone who's noticed a systemic problem." "What do you mean?" "The relief program is designed for emergencies," Thomas explained. "Families who face sudden, complete loss. But there are families in ongoing crisis, struggling not because of weather, but because of age, illness, lack of family support. Those people fall through the cracks because they're not dramatic enough to qualify." Mary understood immediately what he was suggesting. Not to solve the Crawford-specific problem, but to identify a category of ongoing poverty that needed ongoing response. She approached the Reverend after the next Sunday service with a carefully prepared analysis. She'd reviewed the families in the community, identified those whose situations seemed chronically inadequate rather than acutely emergent, and proposed that the church establish a separate program for such cases. Not charity in the traditional sense, but structured support for long-term need. The Reverend listened carefully. And then, surprisingly, he asked Mary to serve on a committee to develop this new program. It should have been a triumph. But what happened instead was more complex. Eleanor Hutchins, who'd cooled considerably toward Mary since the Western incident, suddenly became vocal again. But this time, defending her. Eleanor argued that Mary's proposal was sensible, that the church should indeed implement such a program. Other community leaders followed Eleanor's lead. Mary should have been grateful. Instead, she felt profound unease. Why did she support it? Mary asked Thomas that evening. "Eleanor actively opposed me after the Western situation. Why would she suddenly advocate for my proposal?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Because now it serves her interests." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Eleanor's thinking has shifted," Thomas said carefully. "Initially, you were a threat, a young woman gaining visibility and authority in the community. But now you're serving a function that benefits her position. You're handling something messy and uncomfortable. Relief work isn't glamorous. It's hard and frequently thankless. If you take it on, Eleanor doesn't have to. Mary absorbed this, so she's not actually supporting me. She's supporting what I can do for her." "Likely," Thomas confirmed. "How do you know this?" Mary asked. "How can you see these patterns so clearly?" "Because I've been watching people my entire life," Thomas replied. "Because I've been poor enough and outsider enough to notice how the mechanics of community actually work versus how people pretend they work." This observation, that people were using her, that support often masked self-interest, should have troubled Mary more than it did. Instead, it clarified something. She'd been seeking validation from a community that would never give it unconditionally. The validation she'd received was always contingent on her utility. She accepted the committee position anyway. but with clearer eyes about what she was actually participating in. The relief program for long-term poverty cases began in earnest in March, as winter was finally loosening its grip. Mary worked with 2 other committee members to assess needs, make recommendations, and establish protocols. One of her committee members was Dr. Harrison, the town physician. The other was a woman named Catherine Wells, wife of a successful merchant who'd long been involved in charitable works. Over the course of several weeks of committee meetings, something unexpected happened. Mary began to develop a genuine friendship with Catherine Wells. Catherine, it turned out, was in her late 40s, never quite fit into Riverside society despite her husband's success, and was profoundly intelligent in ways that had largely been channeled into managing charitable works and raising children. "I could have been something," Catherine mentioned once, almost casually, as they reviewed assessment documents. "Studied languages. I was quite good at them, but it wasn't considered particularly useful for a woman of my station, so I learned enough to be accomplished without learning enough to be threatening." "Do you regret it?" Mary asked. "Every day," Catherine said, "and also never." It's complicated. These conversations with Catherine shifted something in Mary's understanding of the community. She began to realize that the women around her, even the ones who'd been dismissive or cold, were themselves constrained by the same systems that had constrained her. Eleanor's cruelty came from a place of limitation. Catherine's kindness came from a place of hard-won understanding. The Reverend's wife's initial coldness likely reflected her own insecurity about her status. This didn't excuse any of it, but it contextualized it in a way that made it easier to navigate without bitterness. By April, as the snow finally melted and the earth began to reveal itself again, the relief program was functioning effectively. Samuel Crawford's grandmother had received both practical assistance and regular visits from Dr. Harrison, who determined that much of her confusion and difficulty could be addressed through better nutrition and warmth. Samuel's frostbite was healing. The boy had color in his face again. The Reverend organized a recognition service acknowledging the committee's work. Eleanor made a speech about Mary's dedication. Catherine squeezed her hand warmly. Thomas, standing in the back of the church, caught Mary's eye and offered a small smile that acknowledged both the accomplishment and the complexity of how it had come about. After the service, as people were dispersing, Thomas took Mary aside. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to really listen." They walked to their wagon, away from the crowd. "What you've done this winter, the assessment work, the program development, the conversations with Catherine, that wasn't about proving yourself to anyone," Thomas said. "That was you being who you actually are. Someone who sees people clearly, someone who thinks systematically about problems, someone willing to work on hard things even when they're emotionally complicated." "I know," Mary said quietly. "I'm beginning to understand that. I'm telling you this because I want you to know that I see it," Thomas continued. "Not as your husband telling you you're doing well, but as another person acknowledging that you're genuinely capable. You don't need external validation for that to be true, but I wanted you to have it anyway." Mary leaned against him, understanding in that moment something she hadn't quite grasped before, that the most important validation wasn't community acknowledgement or professional recognition. It was being truly seen by one person who had decided to actually know you, not as a role you played or a function you served, but as the complete complexity of who you actually were. "I love you," she said simply. "I know," Thomas replied. "And I love the woman you're becoming. Not despite your complications or your mistakes, but including them." As they drove home through the greening spring landscape, Mary realized that their marriage had transformed in ways she hadn't consciously noticed. It was no longer about Thomas rescuing her or proving herself worthy. It was about 2 people engaged in the real work of building a life together, messily, imperfectly, but with genuine intention. The community might never fully accept her. Eleanor might always be calculating her usefulness, but Mary had stopped needing that acceptance to know her own value. And that shift, quieter than any dramatic moment but deeper, was what would ultimately allow her to become not just visible in the community, but genuinely influential, because she was no longer performing for its approval. By early summer, Mary had been in Riverside for nearly a year. The farm was thriving under the combined efforts of Thomas and Mary's management. The relief program was functioning smoothly. Her teaching work had expanded. Several families had requested private instruction for children considered too difficult or slow for group settings. Life had settled into a pattern that felt both sustainable and genuinely fulfilling. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the mail carrier with the kind of significance that suggested its contents were known throughout the town. The return address was from her parents' home in Pennsylvania. Mary recognized her mother's handwriting immediately. She opened it sitting at the kitchen table while Thomas was in the fields. What she read made her stomach clench. Her father was dead. He'd suffered a sudden collapse, a stroke, the doctor had said, though the prognosis was unclear. He'd been unconscious for 3 days before he died. Her mother wrote with a kind of hollow efficiency, describing the practical arrangements, the funeral that had already occurred, the uncertain state of her father's financial affairs. And then, the real point of the letter, her mother was in difficult circumstances. Her father's modest savings had been depleted by medical costs. The house would need to be sold to pay remaining debts. Where was Margaret to send money? How could she help? Mary read the letter 3 times, searching for any expression of personal grief or concern, any acknowledgement of Margaret as a daughter rather than a potential resource. She found none. Thomas found her still sitting at the table 2 hours later, the letter beside her, untouched coffee growing cold in front of her. "What is it?" he asked immediately, reading her face. Mary explained without inflection, as if she were recounting something that had happened to someone else. When she finished, Thomas sat beside her. "Do you want to go?" he asked. "To Pennsylvania? To be with your family?" "No," Mary said immediately. Then more carefully, "I don't know. I shouldn't I? She's my mother. My family needs help. What do you want?" Thomas pressed. Mary couldn't answer. She didn't know what she wanted. She'd spent her entire life being what others needed her to be. The concept of wanting something for herself independent of obligation was still, even after a year of partnership with Thomas, somewhat foreign. Over the next few days, news of her father's death spread through Riverside. Condolences arrived, delivered with varying degrees of sincerity. Catherine Wells came by in person, bringing food and sitting with Mary in companionable silence. Miss Hartford reduced Mary's teaching schedule temporarily. Even Eleanor, with her particular brand of sympathy, made an appearance to acknowledge the loss and inquire about family circumstances. But it was the inquiries about family circumstances that revealed something Mary hadn't anticipated. Her situation was suddenly ambiguous in ways it hadn't been before. She was no longer simply a farmer's wife. She was a woman whose family was in financial difficulty, whose parents were no longer able to provide social anchoring, whose status had become precarious in a way that made certain community members suddenly uncertain about how to treat her. A week after receiving the letter, Mary received a visitor she hadn't expected, Robert Weston, the man whose family she'd assessed as ineligible for substantial relief funds. "I heard about your father," Robert said without preamble, standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands. "I'm sorry for it." Wanted to say so directly. Mary was too surprised to respond immediately. "I know you and I didn't get along," Robert continued, "over the relief situation. I've had time to think about that, about my anger at the decision you made. And I realized something." He paused, clearly struggling with what he was about to say. "You were right," he said finally. "I would have wasted those funds. I would have spent them on drink and nonsense instead of using them for my family's actual needs. And I blamed you for seeing that about me. Blamed you for making a judgment I didn't want to face about myself." Mary still couldn't formulate a response. "What I'm saying is," Robert continued, "I understand now why you made the decisions you did. And I wanted to apologize, and to offer help if you need it. with the farm or money or anything else related to your father's passing and your family's situation. After he left, Mary sat in stunned silence. Robert Weston, who'd publicly accused her of vindictiveness, was offering genuine apology and assistance. That evening, she told Thomas what had happened. "That's significant," Thomas said quietly. "Why?" Mary asked. "Why does his apology matter?" He was angry. "I made a decision he didn't like. He got over it. That's how people work." "It matters," Thomas said, "because it means you're not invisible anymore. You're not someone people dismiss and move past. You're someone people actually see. And that means they eventually have to reckon with having misjudged you. Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "No," Thomas replied. "It's supposed to help you understand that what you've built here is real. People didn't welcome you initially, but you've proven through consistent action that you're worthy of respect. Now Robert is experiencing the uncomfortable realization that he was wrong about you. That's not pleasant for him, but it's also not your burden to manage." Over the following weeks, Mary made a decision. She would send money to her mother, but she would not return to Pennsylvania. She would not take on the responsibility of her mother's financial crisis as her own failure. She would not become invisible again, retreating into the role of dutiful daughter, managing her family's problems. She wrote a letter explaining this. She was clear about what she could contribute financially. She was equally clear that she could not abandon her life in Riverside to manage her mother's affairs. Her mother's response, when it came, was cold. Margaret was being selfish. She was abandoning her family in their time of need. How could she claim to love her mother and refuse to help? Mary read the letter once, then set it aside. The familiar guilt rose in her chest, the old pattern of self-blame, of feeling inadequate, of believing she should be capable of managing everyone else's emotional and practical crises. But something had changed. She recognized the pattern now, and she recognized it for what it was, her mother's attempt to manipulate her through guilt, the same dynamic that had defined their relationship her entire life. She discussed it with Thomas, who listened carefully. "Do you believe that?" he asked when she finished. "That you're being selfish?" "No," Mary said, "but I feel like I'm supposed to. Like that's the right response. That's the difference between belief and conditioning," Thomas said. "You were conditioned to feel guilty for not managing your family's emotional and practical needs. But believing that's right and feeling like you should are two different things." Mary wrote a response to her mother, explaining clearly and without defensiveness that she loved her family, but that she had her own life now. She offered specific, limited help. She declined any discussion of returning to Pennsylvania. She sent the letter before she could second-guess herself. The community's response to all of this was subtle but notable. Word spread that Mary had refused to abandon her husband and her life to manage her family crisis. To some, this confirmed their suspicions that she was selfish. To others, it demonstrated a kind of independence and self-possession that was unusual for a woman. Catherine Wells brought it up directly during one of their relief committee meetings. "People are talking about your decision," Catherine said carefully. "Some think you're being cold to your mother. Others think you're being remarkably clear about boundaries. What do you think?" Mary asked. "I think you're doing what I never quite managed to do," Catherine said. "You're deciding who you are based on your own assessment, not based on what other people need you to be. And I think that's the bravest thing I've seen anyone do." By autumn, a year after arriving at Thomas's farm, Mary had become someone neither she nor the community had anticipated. She was a teacher, a relief worker, a woman with genuine friendships with other women. She was also a woman who'd rejected her family's manipulation, who'd set boundaries with her community, who'd learned to do difficult work in the face of judgment and criticism. Most importantly, she became someone who understood the difference between being useful and being valued, between performing worthiness and actually possessing it. Thomas, observing all of this transformation, made a quiet decision of his own. One evening he presented Mary with a formal proposal, not for marriage, which they were already beyond, but for something different. "I want to add your name to the deed," he said simply. "Make the farm legally half yours. I want you to know that you're not here because I chose to keep you. You're here because you're choosing to stay. And I want that choice to mean something practical, not just emotional." Mary understood what he was offering, not just love or partnership, but actual power and security. The ability to leave if she needed to. The knowledge that she wasn't dependent on his goodwill for her survival. "Why?" she asked. "Because I love you," Thomas said. "And because real love means trusting someone enough to give them actual choice. I don't want you to stay because you have nowhere else to go. I want you to stay because you want to be here, standing in the kitchen of the farm that had become her home, facing the man who'd believed in her long before she believed in herself." Mary understood something fundamental. She had not been rescued. She had been recognized, and that recognition had given her the tools to rescue herself. 2 years into her marriage, Mary stood in what had once been a dilapidated storage building on the northern edge of their property. Thomas had contracted workers to renovate it during the summer, transforming the crumbling structure into something new. Now, as autumn light filtered through clean windows, Mary was unpacking boxes of books, medical equipment, and supplies that would form the foundation of what they'd begun calling the Riverside Wellness Center. The idea had emerged gradually during her conversations with Dr. Harrison and Catherine Wells. The community had no dedicated space for health consultations beyond the doctor's private home. The relief program had revealed dozens of people with chronic health issues that went unaddressed because accessing care was impractical or expensive. And Mary herself had accumulated knowledge about wellness, nutrition, basic remedies, preventive care that she'd been sharing informally, but which deserved more systematic application. Dr. Harrison had been the one to suggest formalizing it. "You already do this work," he'd said. "You identify health problems before they become crises. You understand the intersection between physical condition and circumstance in ways that actually matter. Having a physical space where that work can happen would benefit the entire community." Thomas had supported the idea immediately, proposing they convert the storage building and offering land access. But the community's response had been more complicated. Eleanor Hutchins had asked, with barely concealed suspicion, what qualifications Mary possessed to offer medical advice. The Reverend's wife had worried that it might be seen as presumptuous, that establishing a wellness center without formal credentials might invite criticism from surrounding areas. Even Catherine, who'd been supportive in principle, had raised practical concerns about liability and legitimacy. But Mary had moved forward anyway, with Thomas's steady support and Dr. Harrison's formal endorsement. She'd framed the center not as a replacement for medical care, but as a complementary space, a place where people could bring health concerns that might not warrant the doctor's time or expense, but that deserved attention and response. Now, as she arranged supplies and organized the space, she was acutely aware that she was doing something that would make her either genuinely significant to the community or the subject of much deeper suspicion and criticism. The center's opening was quiet. No grand ceremony or community announcement. Mary simply began seeing people on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, with Dr. Harrison available by appointment on Saturdays for consultations about more complex cases. The first month was slow. A woman with recurring headaches, an elderly man with joint pain, a child whose mother suspected nutritional deficiency. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would constitute a miraculous healing or prove Mary's capabilities in any undeniable way. But gradually, word spread through informal channels. Women told their friends that Mary had identified the source of their child's persistent cough, a mold problem in their home. A man mentioned that following Mary's recommendations about his diet had reduced his energy fluctuations. A mother reported that the breathing exercises Mary had taught her were helping her manage anxiety. By the winter of that year, Mary was seeing people regularly, not in crisis, but in prevention. She was helping people understand the connection between their environment, their choices, and their health outcomes. She was offering alternatives to suffering that had nothing to do with miraculous intervention and everything to do with paying attention. There were failures too. A woman whose chronic pain Mary couldn't identify the source of, despite hours of careful assessment. A child whose condition worsened despite Mary's interventions. An elderly man who declined to follow recommendations and suffered consequences that proper care might have prevented. These failures troubled Mary far more than the successes. She brought them to Dr. Harrison regularly, asking whether she'd missed something, whether she could have done differently. "You're practicing good medicine," Dr. Harrison said one afternoon, "which means you're sometimes going to fail. That's the nature of the work. The question isn't whether you can always succeed. It's whether you're helping more people than you're harming." By the end of the first year of the Wellness Center's operation, the answer seemed to be yes. Mary had become an integral part of the community's health infrastructure, and more surprisingly, she'd developed a kind of reputation that transcended the initial skepticism. She was someone who saw people clearly and responded thoughtfully to their needs. It was during this time that Mary discovered she was pregnant. The realization came quietly, a shift in her body that she recognized before she fully acknowledged it consciously. When she told Thomas, his response was immediate joy, followed by a more complex set of emotions that he voiced carefully. "Are you happy about it?" he asked. "Yes," Mary said, and meant it. "But I'm also aware that it changes things. The center work, teaching, everything will need to shift. What do you want to do?" Thomas asked, and Mary recognized the question as his standard approach to any significant decision, not offering solutions, but asking her to determine what she actually wanted. "I want to continue the work," Mary said, "but differently. I need to think about how." Over the following months, Mary restructured her commitments. She reduced her teaching load, focusing primarily on a select group of advanced students. She brought in Rebecca Hartford as a formal partner at the Wellness Center, splitting responsibilities in ways that allowed both women to maintain meaningful work while accommodating Mary's changing physical capacity. The pregnancy itself was notable for being unremarkable, which, given Mary's childhood of physical neglect and early adult stress, was itself remarkable. She was healthy. She was supported. She had access to adequate nutrition and medical care. Her body responded well to the care it received. Thomas, meanwhile, experienced his own transformation. As Mary's pregnancy progressed, he became increasingly protective, not in the way her father had been, limiting and controlling, but in the way of a partner who was genuinely invested in her well-being. He hired additional help on the farm, so Mary wouldn't need to engage in physically demanding work. He created a comfortable space in their home where she could rest. He learned from Dr. Harrison about pregnancy, preparing himself for birth in ways that suggested he was taking the experience seriously, not as his role to merely witness or support peripherally, but as something he was genuinely invested in managing well. When Mary's labor began on a cold March morning, Thomas was there. He'd sent for Dr. Harrison, but he remained present throughout, not squeamish or distant, but actively engaged. When the pain became intense, he held her hand. When doubt crept in, he reminded her that she was capable of extraordinary things. When the actual moment of birth arrived, he was the second person to welcome their daughter into the world. They named her Eleanor, after Thomas's mother, despite the irony that their Eleanor Hutchins in town would assume the naming was a personal compliment. The baby was small but vigorous, with Mary's determined expression and Thomas's dark eyes, holding their daughter. Mary experienced something she hadn't anticipated, a kind of peace that transcended happiness. This child was hers and Thomas's. She would not be sent away to manage someone else's household. She would not be blamed for existing. She would not be made invisible. The baby's birth marked a kind of culmination of Mary's transformation. She was no longer the invisible third daughter. She was a mother, a healer, an educator, a partner in a genuine marriage. She was a woman who'd claimed her own agency and built a life based on her actual capabilities and values rather than others' diminished expectations. Community response to Eleanor's birth was telling. Even Eleanor Hutchins sent congratulations, along with a carefully selected gift that suggested she was acknowledging Mary's transition from outsider to established community member. More significantly, several women came to visit Mary in the weeks after birth, not just to see the baby, but to talk. Catherine Wells came with meals and stayed for extended conversations. Miss Hartford came with a collection of books she thought Eleanor might eventually enjoy. Even some of the women who'd been cold or dismissive in earlier years made appearances, offering support in ways that suggested genuine warmth, rather than obligatory courtesy. Thomas, watching his wife transformed by motherhood into something even more fully herself, understood that the arrangement his uncle had suggested so casually, finding a poor girl willing to work, had blossomed into something neither of them could have anticipated. He'd married what he thought would be a useful partner. He'd discovered instead a woman whose capabilities and character would reshape not just his life, but the community itself. Years later, when people asked about the surprising trajectory of Thomas Mitchell's farm, from struggling to prosperous, or about the wellness center that had become a model for other communities, or about why the schoolhouse had such rigorous standards that children from surrounding areas sometimes attended, the answer always circled back to the same point. It all began when a man decided to actually see the woman he'd married, rather than treating her as a transaction to be managed. What that decision created was a partnership that neither would have predicted, but both would eventually recognize as the most important choice either of them ever made. 5 years had passed since Eleanor's birth. The farm had grown substantially, not in grandiose ways, but in the steady accumulation that came from consistent, thoughtful management. Thomas had expanded the operation to include improved livestock breeding and more diverse crops. Mary had formalized her work at the wellness center, which now operated 3 days a week with both her and Rebecca Hartford in consistent attendance. They had also welcomed 2 more children, a son named William, who carried his father's quiet observation, and a daughter named Catherine, named after Catherine Wells, who'd become Mary's closest friend and mentor. The children were being raised entirely differently than Mary had been. Eleanor, now 5, could read at a level well beyond her years. William, at 3, was already demonstrating remarkable spatial reasoning and a fascination with how things worked. Little Catherine, just turning 1, seemed to possess a social intuition that drew people to her regardless of her age. But what was most notable about how Thomas and Mary raised their children was not their intellectual capacity. It was their understanding of their own worth. They were never made to feel their primary value lay in their utility. They were encouraged to question, to think, to form opinions about how things should work. They were treated as people with valid perspectives, not as miniature adults whose sole purpose was to be useful. This approach, while raising capable and thoughtful children, had also created certain social complications. The children were difficult to manage in conventional settings. Eleanor questioned the Reverend's explanations of Scripture during Sunday school. William refused to accept arbitrary rules without understanding their rationale. Catherine, despite her social charm, showed no particular interest in the accomplishments that made little girls appealing to adults. The Reverend's wife had mentioned more than once that the children seemed precocious in ways that bordered on disrespectful. Eleanor Hutchins had questioned whether Thomas and Mary were raising them to be properly obedient. Even Catherine Wells, who adored the children, occasionally expressed concern about whether they were being prepared adequately for the compromises that adult society would demand. That Thomas and Mary had discussed these concerns privately. Are we doing them a disservice? Mary had asked one evening as they prepared supper while the children played in the adjacent room. By giving them autonomy and questioning capability, are we leaving them unprepared for the reality of the world? Possibly, Thomas had acknowledged. But I think the alternative, raising them to be compliant without thinking, to accept their circumstances without question, does them a greater disservice. If they learn to think now, they'll be able to adapt to demands later. But if they never learn to think, they'll spend their entire lives simply accepting what they're given. This philosophy was tested more directly when Eleanor, now in Miss Hartford's classroom, began demonstrating behaviors that concerned the teacher. Eleanor would offer interpretations of assigned texts that diverged from the expected responses. She would ask questions that suggested she was thinking about stories rather than simply absorbing them. She would occasionally offer corrections when other students misunderstood concepts, or when Miss Hartford made minor factual errors. Miss Hartford, who appreciated Eleanor's capability, nonetheless struggled with how to channel it appropriately for a 6-year-old in a conventional classroom setting. She's making other students self-conscious, Rebecca mentioned to Mary during one of their wellness center shifts. They're afraid to answer questions because Eleanor will demonstrate a more thorough understanding. It's creating an uncomfortable dynamic. Mary understood the problem immediately. Eleanor was doing what Mary herself had learned to do, thinking carefully, observing thoroughly, forming well-reasoned conclusions. But in a classroom context, Eleanor was inadvertently undermining the social cohesion that Miss Hartford was attempting to build. "What would you suggest?" Mary asked Rebecca. "I'm not entirely sure," Rebecca admitted. "On one hand, I don't want to discourage her curiosity or critical thinking. On the other hand, I need to maintain a functional classroom environment." That evening, Mary and Thomas discussed the situation with Eleanor directly. They didn't frame it as Eleanor needing to change or be less capable. Instead, they framed it as Eleanor learning a different kind of skill, social awareness. "When you answer every question," Mary explained, "or correct interpretations that other students offer, what do you think happens to how they feel?" Eleanor, a thoughtful child who genuinely cared about others' feelings, considered this carefully. "They feel like I'm showing off, or like they're not smart." "Exactly," Thomas said. "That's not your responsibility to fix, but it is your responsibility to be aware of." So the question becomes, what do you want to accomplish in a classroom? Do you want to demonstrate how much you know? Or do you want to help other people learn? "I want to help them learn," Eleanor said. "Then that becomes your goal," Mary said. "And you can accomplish that by asking questions that help them think, rather than by providing answers that make them feel inadequate." What emerged from this conversation wasn't Eleanor learning to be less intelligent or less capable. It was Eleanor learning to modulate her expression of her intelligence in service of different goals. It was a more sophisticated lesson than simple obedience. It was learning that capability could be used in multiple ways depending on context and intention. Miss Hartford noticed the shift within weeks. Eleanor was still engaged, still thinking carefully, but she was doing it in ways that elevated other students rather than overshadowing them. She asked questions that prompted group thinking. When she noticed another student struggling with a concept, she would offer private explanations rather than public corrections. But what Eleanor had learned through this process extended far beyond classroom management. She'd learned that her own capabilities didn't justify dismissing or overshadowing others. She'd learned that intelligence could be expressed with both confidence and humility. She'd learned something that most people never quite grasp, that real capability doesn't require the constant performance of superiority. During this same period, William was learning his own lessons. His tendency to question every rule and expectation had created friction with Thomas, who, while appreciating the questioning, sometimes needed obedience simply because certain safety protocols couldn't be negotiated in real time. Thomas handled this with characteristic directness. He explained to William that there were two categories of rules: safety rules, which couldn't be negotiated because the consequences were non-negotiable, and preference rules, which could be discussed and adjusted as William demonstrated understanding. "If I tell you not to approach the horses without me," Thomas explained, That's a safety rule. The horses can injure you through no malice on their part. That rule exists because I love you. We can talk about anything else, but that one is non-negotiable. But what if I prove I can be safe? William asked, ever the negotiator. Then you graduate to different responsibilities, Thomas said, and eventually you might be trusted with the horses independently. But that only happens if you prove you understand why the rule exists, not by convincing me to change it before you've demonstrated understanding. William, a child who respected reason more than authority, accepted this framework. It didn't make him instantly obedient, but it gave him a mental model where obedience was about respect for the reasoning behind rules rather than mere compliance with authority. As these dynamics played out with their children, Mary and Thomas were also navigating their own evolving partnership. The intensity and discovery of the early years had settled into something deeper, not less passionate, but more established. They had moved past the point of constantly proving things to each other and had entered a phase where they could simply exist together. This brought its own challenges. Without the external pressure of community judgment or the excitement of establishing themselves, they had to deliberately choose engagement with each other. There were stretches where they functioned as co-managers of a household rather than as intimate partners. There were moments where they wondered, with an unspoken anxiety, whether what they'd built would hold up under the ordinary wear of time. It was during one of these periods of ordinary disconnection that Thomas did something unexpected. He proposed that they spend an evening away from the children, staying overnight at an inn in a nearby town. With no responsibilities beyond enjoying each other's company, Mary, surprised and slightly defensive about the implied suggestion that they needed revitalization, initially resisted. "Who will watch the children?" "Catherine has offered," Thomas said. "And Rebecca. They want to help. They understand we need this." What emerged from that overnight trip wasn't dramatic passion or intense reconciliation. It was something quieter, a reminder that they still knew how to talk, to laugh, to engage as people rather than as parents and business partners. It was Thomas telling Mary about a moment from his childhood that he'd never shared before. It was Mary admitting fears about the wellness center that she'd been carrying privately. It was neither of them performing roles, but simply being honest in ways that the ordinary flow of life sometimes precluded. When they returned home, the children were fine, well cared for, and delighted to see them. But Mary and Thomas had been reminded of something crucial, that their partnership wasn't just about what they built together or how they raised their children. It was about who they were to each other when nothing else was being constructed or created. This understanding would prove essential in the years ahead, when the stability they'd so carefully built would face challenges that would require more than capability or good intentions. It would require the kind of foundation that could only be built through years of choosing each other, again and again, not because it was necessary for survival, but because at its core they had decided their life together mattered more than anything else they could build. 8 years into their marriage, Thomas received a letter that would fundamentally challenge everything they had built. It came from a lawyer in Philadelphia, informing him that his late uncle had significant outstanding debts that, according to the will's provisions, Thomas was legally responsible for satisfying. The sum was staggering. It amounted to nearly half the value of the farm. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, holding the letter for a long time before showing it to Mary. When he finally did, his voice was carefully controlled, but Mary could see the tremor in his hands. "We could lose the farm," he said simply. The weeks that followed were characterized by a kind of suspended tension. They consulted lawyers, examined their financial position, explored possible solutions. The reality was stark. They could not satisfy the debt without liquidating major assets. They could sell the farm and start over somewhere else. They could sell certain portions of the property to raise funds, or they could declare bankruptcy, which would devastate their credit and reputation in the community. None of these options were acceptable. But they were the only options available. What was notable about this crisis was how it revealed the quality of the partnership they had built. There were no recriminations, no blame directed at Thomas for inheriting the debt, no suggestions that Mary should have chosen differently all those years ago. Instead, they approached the problem systematically, as they approached most difficulties. "What do we actually need?" Mary asked one evening as they reviewed their finances. "What is essential?" "The farm generates enough to sustain us," Thomas said. "But barely. We don't have significant surplus for debt repayment." "Then we need to generate surplus," Mary said. "Which means we need to either increase revenue or decrease expenses." They began mapping possibilities. The wellness center, while valued by the community, didn't generate profit. It operated on a small budget covered by donations and modest fees that were scaled to people's ability to pay. Mary's teaching income was similarly modest. The farm was profitable, but not dramatically so. "What if we formalized the wellness center?" Thomas suggested. "What if it generated revenue instead of operating at cost?" Mary resisted this immediately. "People can't afford increased fees. The whole point is that it's accessible, not for everyone," Thomas said carefully. "What if those who could pay more did, and we use that to subsidize those who couldn't?" It was a simple idea, but implementing it was complex. It meant raising fees for some while maintaining accessibility for others. It meant being transparent about the actual costs of the service. It meant accepting that not everyone would be able to access the center at the same price point. When Mary proposed this to the community, the response was mixed. Some people understood immediately and were willing to pay increased rates. Others felt the change as a betrayal, interpreting it as the wellness center becoming a business rather than a community service. Eleanor Hutchins, for the first time in years, actively opposed something Mary was doing. "This is exactly what happens when you give someone too much power," Eleanor said at a community meeting. "She's decided the center needs to be profitable, and now she's pricing out the very people it was meant to serve." What Eleanor didn't know, what only a handful of people knew, was that the fee restructuring was funding Thomas and Mary's effort to pay down an inherited debt they'd never chosen, but were nonetheless legally responsible for. Mary had considered explaining this publicly, but Thomas had advised against it. "It will complicate the narrative," he'd said. "If people think you're doing this to save the farm, they'll judge it through a lens of personal interest rather than genuine community benefit. Better to let them question the decision on its merits." So Mary stood in front of the community and defended a fee structure that she knew would upset some people, without being able to explain the real reason behind it. She accepted the criticism. She endured Eleanor's pointed comments. She listened to concerns about accessibility while maintaining the structure she'd established. What happened next was surprising. While some people were upset about the fees, others, particularly those who could afford higher rates, stepped forward to pay substantially more than the new base rate suggested. Several community members, including Dr. Harrison and Catherine Wells, made direct financial contributions to a fund specifically designated for subsidizing low-income access. Within 6 months, the Wellness Center was not only covering its operational costs, but generating modest surplus that could be directed toward other needs. At the same time, Thomas had begun exploring expansion of the farm's operations. He identified a crop that had strong market demand in the larger cities and high profit margins. He negotiated contracts directly with buyers rather than selling through local distributors. He hired additional workers with profit-sharing arrangements that motivated them to maximize yields. These changes transformed the farm's financial profile within a year. What had been a stable but modest enterprise became genuinely profitable. Throughout this period, Mary and Thomas operated with remarkable coordination, but also with a kind of mutual independence. Mary was managing the Wellness Center restructuring. Thomas was managing the farm expansion. They consulted each other about major decisions, but they didn't wait for consensus before acting. They developed sufficient trust in each other's judgment that they could move forward with separate spheres of responsibility. Their children, meanwhile, were observing all of this. Eleanor, now 13, was beginning to understand that her parents' lives involved complexities beyond her immediate experience. William, at 11, was already asking questions about the farm's financial structure. Even Catherine, at 6, noticed the slightly increased tension in the household and asked directly if something was wrong. "Something challenging is happening," Mary told her, "but it's something we can solve." That's what life is sometimes, challenges that require work to solve. But that can be solved if you're thoughtful and persistent. By year 2 of managing the inherited debt, Thomas and Mary could see a genuine path to resolution. They would need to continue operating at elevated revenue levels for several more years, but the debt would eventually be cleared. The real turning point came when Thomas received a letter from the lawyer indicating that one of his uncle's other relatives had filed a claim suggesting the debt was invalid due to improper accounting. The resulting legal battle was time-consuming and emotionally draining, but ultimately resulted in a settlement that reduced the overall debt by approximately 30%. When Thomas told Mary the news, she experienced something unexpected, exhaustion rather than relief. The past 2 years had been lived in a kind of constant intensity. Every financial decision had carried weight. Every choice about resource allocation had felt consequential in ways that went beyond normal business management. "We did it," Thomas said, holding her as she sat on the porch one evening after the settlement was finalized. "We did," Mary agreed. "But I'm realizing something." "What?" "I'm realizing that I don't actually know who I am when I'm not solving a problem," Mary said quietly. "My entire life has been about managing crises or handling challenges. Even when things were stable, I was building something. I don't actually know how to just be." Thomas considered this. "Then maybe that's the next thing to learn." What emerged from this realization was a decision to deliberately create space in their lives that wasn't about achievement or solving problems. Mary stepped back from expanding the wellness center. Thomas hired management to handle more of the farm operations, reducing his day-to-day involvement. They began taking regular walks together without discussing business. They started reading books aloud to each other in the evenings, not improving books or educational material, but novels and poetry meant purely for enjoyment. They discovered that being together without purpose or goal was actually more challenging than solving a debt crisis. It required a kind of vulnerability that problem-solving had allowed them to avoid, but through this practice, they also discovered something crucial, that the foundation of their partnership was deep enough to sustain periods of quiet, that they could exist together without constantly building or proving or achieving, that their value to each other wasn't contingent on what they were accomplishing, but simply on the fact that they had chosen to continue choosing each other. Year after year, through difficulty and stability, crisis and peace, the debt was eventually cleared. The farm continued to prosper. The wellness center became a model for other communities. But what mattered most to Mary and Thomas was something quieter, the understanding that they had weathered a genuine threat to their stability and had emerged not just intact, but with deeper knowledge of what their partnership actually meant. 25 years after Mary stepped off the wagon onto Thomas Mitchell's farm, she stood on the porch they'd built together, watching the sun descend over fields that had become her own. Eleanor was now a teacher and scholar. William managed the farm's expansion. Catherine moved through Riverside with the confidence of someone who'd never been made to doubt her worth. The community had transformed around them in ways neither could have predicted. The wellness center had become a model for other regions. The farm's profit-sharing arrangements were being adopted by neighboring operations. But the real transformation was quieter. It was in how people understood partnership, marriage, and what was possible for themselves. Thomas found Mary on the porch as evening settled in. "Eleanor came by today," he said. "She wants to establish her own agricultural education center. She's asking if we'd transfer portions of the farm to her and William. Mary understood immediately what he was offering her, the chance to let go, to allow their children to build something new rather than preserve what had been created. We should say yes, Mary said. That week, Mary began writing, not for anyone specific, but for anyone who needed to know that partnership could be built on something other than obligation or transaction. She documented her journey from invisibility to presence. She wrote about the moment Thomas had looked at her with genuine curiosity. She wrote about the slow process of learning that her thoughts mattered. She was careful not to make it a rescue narrative. Instead, she was honest about the difficulties, the conflicts, the misunderstandings that had emerged along the way. But she was equally clear that those difficulties had been navigable because the foundation of genuine seeing had never been broken. Catherine Wells read the manuscript and told her plainly, "This will upset people. They want rescue narratives. This suggests something more demanding, that partnership requires actual work and continued choice." "I know," Mary said, "but people need to understand that difference." Word of the writing spread through Riverside. Some dismissed it as self-indulgent. Others recognized themselves in the account and began to question their own circumstances. Letters arrived from women she'd never met, describing how reading it had prompted different conversations with their husbands, different demands for their own lives. On their 25th anniversary, Thomas and Mary hosted a gathering at the farm. Their children came, grandchildren, community members touched by their work. Eleanor Hutchins, now elderly, spent considerable time speaking with Mary. "I've watched many marriages," Eleanor said with the honesty that age brings. "But what I see in yours is something different. You didn't rescue each other. You recognized each other. And from that recognition, you built something that actually lasts." Standing on the porch later that evening, Thomas asked, "Do you ever regret it?" "No," Mary replied. "Not because everything was perfect, but because you saw me. You actually saw me, not what I could do for you or how useful I could be. You continued to see me as I changed and became different versions of myself. That's rare enough. What does it feel like?" Thomas asked. "Grateful," Mary said. "Fundamentally grateful for the choice you made in that first moment, and for every moment after when you chose to keep seeing me." As they stood together in the darkness, Mary understood something she'd always suspected but never articulated. The real journey hadn't been from invisibility to visibility, though that had certainly happened. The real journey had been from believing her value depended on what she could produce to understanding that her value simply existed, intrinsically and completely, independent of anyone's assessment or need. And the person who had facilitated that understanding, not through saving her, but through genuinely seeing her, had simply been a man willing to look beyond what the world told him to see, and who continued day after day, year after year, to actually look. That was what everything had been about. Not rescue, not transformation driven by external circumstances, but the quiet revolutionary act of one person choosing to truly see another, and the way that seeing had changed everything that followed. In the end, the most powerful thing a marriage could offer wasn't passion or security or social status. It was the profound experience of being fully known by another human being. And from that knowing, everything else, the farm, the wellness center, the confident children, the changed community, had naturally grown. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.